Hello and welcome back to the Culture Creators podcast. Today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Emeritus Professor Gary Martin. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brent. It's great to be here.
So for those who don't know you, you're the CEO of the Australian Institute of Management here in Western Australia.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, just briefly, so you can place yourself before we launch into the conversation?
Yeah, so my background is primary school teacher, first of all, university academic, and then on to university administration or leadership type roles, and now to the Australian Institute of Management in WA. It's a position as CEO that I've held for 11 years. I had to stop and think.
Right.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Good. Well, I'm glad you are. So the line of inquiry of this podcast is around culture and what are the mechanics and dynamics and what people can do to be an active active proponent within culture.
Yes.
So, within the business world, you obviously interact with a lot of senior people in your position and with your connections, and obviously a lot of managers and leaders through the Institute. So I think, as I said just before we started, I see you almost as a meta node for some looking into this.
Yeah, I get to speak to so many people from different workplaces, from the government workplaces, from corporate organisations, from charitable organisations, for other not-for-profits like us. And I get to speak to not only their CEOs, but their executive, their managers. But really interesting, if you want to hear how things actually are, it's not the leaders and managers that you speak to, it's the everyday people, the everyday workers. And I find some of the most fascinating discussions I've had about workplaces in a general sense have come from people that have actually hunted me down to have a chat about what's happening in their workplace.
Right.
And obviously it's a confidential chat, but they've teased out different things that are happening in their workplace. They're different conversations to what I've had with the leaders and managers of different organisations. You actually get a much rawer, if there's a word like that, a raw view of the workplace when you speak to everyday workers and you hear the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. So that raises a really interesting question. In terms of culture, are you seeing much of a difference between how the leaders of organisations perceive the culture of an organisation and how some of these everyday workers are actually experiencing it?
Look, I think there is a divide there. I think people talked about recently, it was a bit of a fad, but had some substance behind it. People talked about the great resignation, but there's also something where people left the workplace to find, another organisation where the grass was greener. Sometimes what people found is the grass isn't greener. In fact, it's fake lawn that they've wandered onto, which is never a good thing. And they start to miss the workplace that they were in. But there's also this thing called the Great Divide as well. Okay. So the Great Divide is about what organisational leaders and managers think about the culture of an organisation and what people embedded within a workplace think about it as well. So there is that divide in many cases, and quite often where the culture might be described as more toxic, the divide is wider. Where the two come together, it's probably a more positive, I guess, culture. But one of the other things that I would say just on that is that sometimes when we talk about culture, we probably shouldn't be talking about culture. We should be talking about the different components that make that culture as well, and trying to break things down a little bit, because cultures tends to be a catch-all type phrase. It catches everything that happens in the workplace, and that might be a good way to describe it. But when you analyse things, you need to break it into, which is what analysis is, you need to break it into chunks and work out different dimensions, I guess.
So how would you break it down?
Yeah, there's lots of ways of breaking it down, but if I were to first of all perhaps isolate one thing, one element, and that is just the interactions that go on in the workplace. Yes. Now, I think in some organisations, some of the interactions that go on between people at the same level or across an organisation, there's a particular way of describing some of the ways that people act now. I call it numbness, corporate numbness. So I think there's in some workplaces there's this type of numb approach to what happens, and if there's this numbness present, it kind of means that culture's not bad, but it's not really good either. So, if I give you an example, Bryn, of something that I think is numb, people quite often, for example, talk about, I've got an open door policy, right?
Yes.
So my door's open. If someone rolls up to see me, they give me a frown. So I haven't really got an open door type policy at all. I've got a closed door policy, but I advertise it. So the message there is,
it's a bit of a mixed message.
Yeah, don't come see me when I'm busy. So if you say you've got an open door policy, then you have to. Then there's this other thing. People think that they have to speak in jargon and they have to, smash it. I'm smashing it, or I've got to go for the low-hanging fruit, or all these sorts of things to fit in. Yeah, it's called, I think, way I described it recently, because I'd seen it elsewhere and I quite like it, was jargon monoxide. It's poisonous, right?
Jargon monoxide.
Yeah, it really does. I think it's sort of, unless you use the language, you're not one of the crowd, basically. So, there's that dimension of these contradictions that happen in where you've got these other things that I'd say that causes corporate numbness is, I call them wet noodle managers who flip and flop all over the place like a noodle to impress this person, and they worked out that didn't impress another person, so they jump across, basically. So that's their leadership, but it's wet noodle type leadership. They flop around the place. These are other things that cause people to go numb and have this, it's not necessarily, well, it is, it's a little bit toxic, but it's this, I don't really care what goes on in this place anymore type attitudes, because there's so many double meanings.
Yes.
And I think
so all these incongruent, contradictory messages.
Yeah, so I think, if you look about corporate numbness, it's actually about, there's a constant stream of mixed messages. Okay. So that's one of the ways I would break into an aspect of culture. Then I'd just take on to this next thing I'd tack on to something which most people wouldn't say it's part of the culture, but it actually ends up being, and that's flexible work arrangements. So we've got this thing, again, it might relate to mixed messages, but we have this thing where people embrace flexible work arrangements, particularly when you're being interviewed. Oh yes, we embrace flexible work arrangements. But when you get into the workplace, you're actually treated as a second-class citizen if you're part-time or you work remotely. And the promotion that you get, because you're not around people, you've got less chance of career advancement because you're out of mind, out of sight type of thing. So there's this other thing, very much part of cultures now, workplace culture, or workplaces more broadly, is this idea of flexible work arrangements. And it works for some and it doesn't work for others. So we've got these, part of the culture now is how do we extend, our relationships and so on with people who are not in the workplace. And that impacts culture. And how do people outside the workplace who are working remotely feed in and have the same opportunities as those there, so that are in the workplace. So, if you just pick on that one area of workplace flexibility, there's haves and have-nots across all of that. And that's a really big part of our culture now, because people think of culture being just how you interact with people in the workplace. Even once you're in that workplace, we've got this thing now too that increasingly people have become concerned with, people in the workplace. When is it okay to talk to people anymore? Is there free flow of communication, or will I be accused of desk bombing you? That's the latest thing that people talk about, is there was a time if you needed something, right? And this is again part of the culture. If you want something, you go over to their desk and you'd have a chat to them.
Yep.
These days, people have headphones on. They don't have do not disturb signs when they're at their desk because they don't like that interaction, particularly after they've been working from home and they get that straight run of no
interruptions.
And
this is different to, I've got to work on a document and I've got a deadline and I've got to get it done, so please respect the fact I've got work to do. This is more, I just don't want interaction.
That's right. I mean, I think the I don't want the interaction sometimes has that a facade there that is I'm busy, I can't speak.
Well, it's
people
an easy
don't
one
want
to play in the workplace, isn't it?
Of course,
I'm
it is.
busy, please.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, through the emergence of these things called, you know, desk bombing, basically, it's what is the quality of the interaction in that workplace, even if everybody is in there. So again, break it down to another dimension. What makes up your culture? So far I've said, you know, it's about flexible work arrangements.
Numbness,
it's
flexible work, desk bombing.
Numbness of the double standards. You can start to isolate some of these things and have a look. Then you've got that whole area of respect. Okay, so people want respect. Most people can talk about what's disrespectful, but they can't talk about what respectful behaviour is.
Yes.
Unfortunately, what we've had at the moment is we've had cases where respect is about sexual harassment, bullying, those sorts of highly toxic behaviours and unwanted behaviours. But respect, they're at the you know, one end of a continuum. They're the worst possible things. But respect starts with just using someone's name when you walk past them.
Yes.
And again, people say, if I don't have sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace, then we've got a respectful workplace.
Yeah. But the absence of something is not the presence
no,
of something.
There's all these other things that lead to, you know, if you don't have people respecting at the other end of continue using people's names, you know, listening to them, not chopping them off and stuff, all those things are at one end of a scale, and then sexual harassment, bullying, assault, all those other sorts of things, highly disrespectful, are at the other end. So, you know, you can isolate. People talk about respect, they talk about work arrangements, and I think one of the most interesting things in recent times is people suddenly say, we're going to do a 4-day working week, and that's going to make the culture change. And for some people, that's like a pressure cooker, working 4 days and compacting it, you know, 5 days into 4 days. And for other people, they thrive on it. So again, there's different types of interventions, if you like, into workplaces that will also need to be looked at to see what actually happens in the workplace. But the one, I guess, Bryn, that I really want to highlight, because this is completely about the culture of the organisation. Again, if you take a bit of a deep dive into this, it's this whole idea of whether someone comes into an organisation or within the organisation, they're a cultural fit. Okay, so people rave about cultural fit, right? In other words, they fit with the culture of an organisation.
Right. So they can assimilate.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, in organisations these days where people spruik diversity, what people do is we're still at the situation where you fit in my culture, this workplace, if you're like me. We've still got a lot of that.
Yes.
And part of talking about cultural fit, we need to rethink that, and you know, other people refer to it now as cultural add. So if we're sitting here together, I'm interviewing you because you like golf, and I like golf. Actually, don't, but if you give you that example, then we're connected, right?
And I'm in.
I can see some of me in you,
yes,
and that means you're going to be the right fit, and that's not what cultural fit was meant to be about. It was originally meant to be about how this person that we're hiring would subscribe to the values, and they endorse those values, and their behaviours were similar, respectful, whatever. You know, they'd lived the values of the organisation. The purpose of the organisation resonated, but it's now been reduced, unfortunately, to oh, I can see a bit of you in me. I could have coffee with you.
Yeah.
That's that
You're
concept
safe.
of cultural fit. Yeah.
You're safe.
Yeah, and I'm not threatened by it, and you're not going to bring anything too different. But we should be hiring people with cultural add in mind,
Yes.
and that is they bring some difference to the workplace, and we don't.
Different frame.
We don't do that
reference.
enough. Different frame altogether. The fact that you're from a different country, you're a different religion, you know, the whole gender diversity, all those sorts of things. We should really be embracing that diversity, but we've still got a lot of work to try and change that cultural fit to cultural add. And I think that's why I say that one in particular is really, really significant when we talk about people's culture, because then we've got the situation that relates to that where someone comes in, okay, they're quite different to us, right, in any number of ways. Bring them into the workplace, tick, you know, you've got the diversity, you've met the diversity criteria, but once they get into the organisation, they're not included, right? So they end up being, you know, a great opportunity to come in here. We're going to employ people from all different backgrounds, and once they come in, they're not included because they're too different and people don't embrace that diversity. And that makes a significant difference to a culture of an organisation.
So, as I listen to you, and we've talked about the numbness, we talked about the working practices, we talked about the desk bombing, we've talked about the value, the cultural fit. One of the reasons why I am here today, where I am, and talking to you, and on this line of inquiry in the work that I do now, is that so my educational background is in organisational psychology. I spent 15 years as a corporate management consultant working at places like Turner & Townsend and Accenture, then moving into Chevron and places like that. What I became increasingly frustrated about was being in the presence of very rational, well thought out, possibly data driven decisions, which on paper and against latest common practice, spot on, right? And this is what we're going to do. However, as I sat there was a part of me, and there's always been a part of me, that's been connected to who I am as a human being, right? And as I said to you before, my previous podcast spent 4 years investigating the patterns of behaviour, the patterns that flow through life, not patterns of behaviour, because it's deeper than that. And so I would sit listening to these, and I would have this instinctive thing within me that said, this will just disintegrate in 12 to 18 months. And as I started my junior career, I couldn't articulate that. And so I had to bow down to the experience of people around me. And then I see it, and then I see it again, and then I see it again. And as I've gone further into my career, and now I'm at the point where I can articulate why these decisions won't work, because they will conflict with just how we show up and how we're designed as humans. You know, we are emotional. We do connect. We need connection. We are inquisitive. We are also impatient. We need to be in connected, collaborative environments for us to thrive. When we are put in individualistic, hierarchical, competitive environments, we don't thrive. And I keep seeing in the workplace these very rational, like, yes, my door is always open, Gary, but it's not. No. At a human behavioural level, at a human presence and showing up, it's not. You know, I want cultural add because I don't want to feel the fear of having someone new. So to what degree are we in this very, and I can see this as accelerating and accelerating and accelerated. To what degree are we at a point now where the way that workplaces are structured, operated, executed, and looked upon have diverged so far from the true nature of who we are that this is where all this damage is occurring, and this is where we see workplace stress and anxiety. And in the place of, was it Ernst & Young, where the young lady took her life before Christmas? So this is real, and yes, it is part of culture. Yes, it is part of the individual. Yes, it's part of the organising principles. It's all of these things all at once. To what degree are we avoiding that by staying in these fantastic rational edifices that we use to navigate the world that we think will work, but then all of a sudden we get surprised in 12 months when the team disintegrates and everyone's falling out with each other.
Or people leave, or
people
move
leave
on and so on.
Like that.
Yeah, look, I think it comes back to what I was saying before. The people that make the decisions in an organisation at the highest level and look
That
at the
great
data
divide.
and so on, they are the people that will say, this is where we do it. They'll have a view that it's a great thing for the people in an organisation. But then if you speak to some of the people down at the other end of the scale, they'll be the ones that will be able to say, well, this is not working for me. And they'll come up with things like, here's a new initiative, A, B, C, D, all these sorts of things, going to make lots of money. But you know what? I'm really bored doing this job, because the job is not, what the job is actually something that's so routine, there's no challenge for that.
Yep.
And actually it's not a full-time job there. And then you get the reverse. Some people suddenly find themselves doing 3 jobs instead of 1 job.
Absolutely.
And everything is rolled into that job. So you've got the burnout on the one hand, where people get burnt out because they're trying to do 3 jobs which are overstimulating. And then you've got that rust out where people corrode because they've not got enough to do all the tasks they've got. So it comes down to some of the design of the roles and so on as well, that don't necessarily match with the business case up here, which was to do something in particular. So I think there's a certain amount of rethinking stuff, and I don't think we necessarily have got to the point where, even though people that have talked about the pandemic and there's a workplace reset and all that sort of stuff, we haven't thought about our people, how it's going to impact on our people. And also, people haven't been front of mind with some of these decisions, and that's going to then impact the culture as well. I think when we plan the big picture, there's almost a case now to have a matrix alongside it of measures, things like the level of emotional intelligence. People always talk about emotional intelligence, for example.
Yeah.
So, that's a consideration within organisation. And then there's, if we go back to cultural add versus cultural fit, there's what's the cultural intelligence like in this organisation? What's the adaptability quotient, or the AQ? How do people change? Can people change? And those are the considerations that people don't think about when they're planning the bigger pictures, and it's not easy. So
they need a framework underneath of how we actually flow and how we actually work. It's one thing pulling out EQ, or AQ or CQ,
but there's multiple things in it.
There is a flow and there is a pattern, and it's dropping down to that.
So you've got to look at an initiative, like a direction for a company, through multiple lenses, basically. And I sometimes and they all come down to people in the end, and I don't think that sometimes we think about the people dimension alongside the strategic imperative, and what messages they're sending too. I mean, I was fascinated at the moment that you've got companies making massive profits, but their customers are suffering at the same time. So how does that work? I mean, and people making massive profits, but the customers are suffering. And what does that say to people in an organisation? Yes, if you're in business, you're meant to make money, but when you've got periods of high inflation already, are you using that inflation to boost your profits even further because people are more tolerant? Now, if I'm in an organisation that's doing that, I could be saying, people in that organisation could be saying, rah, 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 this is record profits and so on. But there's another message that some people are going to get there, which is they're going to get this, we're really exploiting the customers, and there are people facing real hardships out there because we're going overboard with this. So again, it comes down to that purpose that I was talking about before. People align with a purpose, and that's really important that they do have that purpose. But when organisations step out of what someone signed up for, then again, it reduces their motivation and so on as it starts to crumble, and people say, what am I really working for here? Or who am I really working for? What are we trying to do? And we're increasingly seeing how purpose will impact the culture of an organisation. But it comes down to what I'm saying is that when you talk about culture, and people throw that word around broadly, you've got to start to break it up into all different dimensions that might impact the culture, and then you'll get a better sense of how things are really working in an organisation.
Is it breaking it down, or is it actually having a frame of reference of what it actually is?
I think you
maybe a bit of both.
If you talk about culture and then you really don't know what that is, and people define culture so differently.
Yes.
I've
had a lot of fun with this podcast and outside of this podcast, just asking
on that question. And that's why I avoid that, because I say it's a mixture of different things that happen in workplace and how workplaces are constructed, and that's going to lead to that how people feel about an organisation. Like go over the same things. Respect is a big dimension. The challenge of a work, for example, or the lack of challenge in your job, and the workload type stuff that goes with it. All of that. I could have the best purpose. I could have everything. I have flexible work arrangements.
Well-polished organisational values.
Managers who do what they say, except when it comes to workload, I'm just smashed, to use the jargon that people will use. I'm smashed because I've got 5 jobs in one, but everything else is good.
Yes.
And that can impact. So breaking it down into all those segments, components, whatever, is going to influence, because that person or that group of people that are overworked, they're the same people that are going to be rude to others because they're worn down, and that's going to flow through the organisation bit by bit. So you really have to, in a sense, how we're going to improve our culture is really, how can we improve this? How can we enhance that? How can we do this? There's a set of questions that each organisation needs to come up with because they know their organisation's best.
And I think there's also, and this is where it can be quite almost, existentially confronting of where is our culture today?
Sure.
Because also culture can be like this battery or hard drive of all the stuff that's happened before, that's been unresolved, that is still being carried along.
Yeah, of course. I think that's I guess in terms of some of the things that go unnoticed in an organisation, they're forever there, because people remember things that go unnoticed, where poor behaviour was not pulled up, where good behaviour was not actually
lauded.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that films this sort of, it does fill up like a hard drive, and sometimes that hard drive crashes because there's too much in there.
Exactly. And sometimes people don't want to face up to what's actually in it.
Sure.
It's like, well, let's talk about building a new culture over here, and not recognising this is actually where we got to today. And that can be a little bit murky.
Bryn, the other thing though is, so far we've really talked about though that it's leaders and managers need to look, but individuals need to look at themselves as well. It's not just about leaders and managers. It's actually about individuals and their own behaviours and so on as well. One of the things I chuckle about, for example, is a lot of the stuff that tells you to be your authentic self in the workplace. And I think that's bad advice, because people in the workplace don't want you to bring all of you in the workplace. They actually want the best bits that suit the workplace. There's a lot of things outside the workplace that you don't want to bring, but people say, just be yourself. You can't be your complete self within the workplace. Whoever thought of it has provided bad career advice. You can stand for certain things, but you don't want to bring your poor behaviours, and everybody's got bad behaviours or poor behaviours at different levels, obviously, into the workplace. So that's why I think sometimes we have to think about which bits we bring into the workplace and stop talking about an authentic, which is the real us, because nobody actually wants the real you in the workplace. They actually want the best bits that make the workplace work. That doesn't mean you have to deny where you're from, who you are. But when we talk about being authentic, being your actual self, you don't put on a show for people. Sometimes you need to do a little bit of that, and you need to work with other people to do it. So it is about an individual, and then and modifying some of those behaviours that you might have at home that you bring in to make everything work, because you're not alone. You're working with a group of people usually.
True.
So I think it's the culture is an individual responsibility. And over the years, people have been saying, be yourself, be yourself. Yes, be yourself, but be the best bits of yourself in the workplace as well.
I think...
Does that make sense? It's
look, it
interesting
does.
Concept.
It does. And I always like to play with things like that. I mean, obviously, if there's a large drama going on in your personal life, it's difficult to just wipe that off your feet.
Yeah, you can bring that in. But you can bring that in, yeah.
Yeah. And the other part about bring your authentic self in is, it's going to sound quite blunt what I'm about to say, is that works well if you actually know what your authentic self is. If you are connected to who you really, really are, then by all means bring that to work.
Yes.
Because then you will be able to handle your good and bad behaviours wherever you are. If you are not connected to your authentic self, then it's probably best you just bring the best parts.
Yeah, if you don't know what you are. I think you're right. So, for example, if my language, if every second word that I utter outside the workplace is an expletive, I don't want to bring that.
Yeah.
And that's me. That's the real me. I don't want to bring that into the workplace
100%.
Because you've got to be thinking about sensitivities for others. If I'm a CEO, imagine this. Okay, imagine when I was first CEO here, right? I came in from a university, different organisation, big organisation. I come into this organisation and I say, this is what I'm thinking, and I say what I'm thinking. I really, I'm not sure, I'm not confident to do this job. I'm used to having 20 people around me to do the work, and in a bigger organisation, I'm not really confident about this, right?
Yeah.
What message does that send? If I'm being my real self when I first came here, what does that send to people? I'm confident in managing large organisation, but a smaller organisation, not for profit, versus an organisation that's government funded. I walk into a new situation, certainly got things that I knew I could do in this organisation, but thinking, before I had someone that could do this for me or do this for me, do this. Am I really confident? And imagine when I meet with my staff saying, I really need your support because I'm not really confident I can do this job. Now I had some confidence.
Yes.
But I wasn't assured of success because they come from a different background, complementary. So again, do you come out with that? I know CEOs have adopted that approach within an organisation. What's the impact on the culture? People think, this is going to be interesting because this person's not confident, or this person said this, or,
Especially if the culture of the organisation likes a strong leader.
Well, that's right. And most do. Most want to know that there's strong leadership that's going to give them job security, that's going to give them a well-paid job, that's going to give them some flexibility. They're going to be doing some interesting things. Have a leader that presents as not confident, even though most leaders, when they go into a new role, have got this horrible feeling, how's this going to turn out? You never say that to people.
No.
But say it, and there'll be people that start to look at it and think, this is not going to end well. So you're authentic or not,
Maybe don't say it. Maybe go and deal with it. So one of the closing questions I ask all my guests is, what's the one thing about culture that we are not talking about that we probably should do?
I think that a lot of those things that I've talked about are exactly the answer. I reckon it's What we never talk about is the very first thing we started with. We don't talk about the numbness that some of our workplaces create, where people end up. There are people in every workplace who get up and feel numb about going to work. Okay, numb is not, they don't feel dreadful about it, but they don't feel good about it because they see so many contradictions. They might have created some of those contradictions themselves, but we never put it on the table that, stop and take a back seat and say, we use crazy language. We got some really strange ways and difficult ways of doing things around here. We don't have those discussions, and that leads to that numbness. What's a way of, actually, I'll give you an example now of that. I go back to the 4-day working week, right? We never actually had a discussion with people to say, in a lot of organisations who went in a trial, for example, what are the things that, what are the alternatives to do this? Like, we never stop and say that in organisations. What are the different ways of doing things? And if we just said there are some different ways of doing things, we might avoid some of that numbness.
Yes.
So, for example, some people don't want to have a 4-day working week, but they wouldn't mind having 2 weeks extra holidays in a block somewhere. So they could do this or they could do that. Yeah. But instead, everyone that's gone on a 4-day working week, this is going to be great for the culture. People are going to feel balanced. They're going to do they have fresh time.
It's another one of those rational, well thought out decisions, isn't it?
But not. Isn't a better way is just to say to people, I'm going to give you 2 weeks extra leave. You use the leave how it suits you. So if you want to work a 9-day fortnight and still have 2 weeks over Christmas, do that. But no, it's a prescribed model of 4 days. And so to bring that back around, we never talk about what might be done differently or how we might do things differently that might bring people on board more. So the one we started with is open door policy. No, we don't have an open door policy. You need to make a time, make it clear. So what are the alternatives? Is there a time of the day where there is an open door policy or a time of the week? Make it clear to people instead of talking in riddles all the time, and look for the alternatives, ways of behaving. And we don't talk to people about the alternatives. When it comes to them, we decide, and we assume everyone's going to be happy with that.
Gary, this has been brilliant.
Thanks, Bryn.
I've super enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.